Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. It's the sixth meeting in the road to COP28, and we are seeing cross-cutting actions. Today, we're going to discuss a very important topic, which is human mobility and climate crisis. I'm going to give the floor to Juan, who is the UNEP Regional Director, so that we can get into the topic. Daniel, thank you very much. It's great to be here with you today in this new edition of the seminars into the road to COP28. As Daniel mentioned, today we're going to address a very relevant topic, which is precisely the connection between human mobility and climate change. I want to start thanking you, the organizers of this event, the regional office of the UNEF, and the Global Adaptation Network, as well as everyone joining us today, especially the International Organization of Migration, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the World Food Programme, and the Copenhagen Center. And I want to mention as well that we have a participation with a leader in the affected communities by these situations of human mobility and climate change, who is Guadalupe from Mexico. Just very briefly, I would like to start talking about the evidence that we have of the relationship between climate change and migration. At this moment, the information we have in the year 2022 indicates that about 21 or 22 million people are displaced each year internally as a consequence of storms, migrations, forest fires, droughts, and extreme temperatures. According to the World Meteorological Organization and the data from the sixth report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate, there's been 175 disasters and 80% had a climate origin. It's been 40% of the death associated with disasters, and also a large percentage of economic loss. Hurricanes have been devastating Central America and the Caribbean, especially last year. We are seeing how the long-term droughts are impacting economic sectors in the region, like transportation, agriculture, and water supply. And of course, we are observing an increase in sea levels, which affects every area, coastal and continental, most especially SIDS. We forecast that the impact of climate change will continue to increase and have a direct impact in populations and therefore in human mobility in this region. And even in an optimistic scenario of a 1.5 rise in global temperature, the hydrometeorological events that are affecting the region will continue to increase, as well as their intensity. At this moment, in Latin America and the Caribbean, in the north of Brazil, Central America, and the Andes, we have the most sensitive zones related to mobility impulsed by climate change. It affects the water safety, food safety, the social economical situations of the populations there. And this is also linked with political situations, economical situations that will force people to move their place of living. In this sense, we also want to point out that human mobility and climate mobility has a linkage with a not planned urbanization process in the region, a region that is becoming ever more urbanized and where that organization is not taking into account the climate conditions and vulnerability status. So climate mobility sets out very important topics on climate justice in Latin America and the Caribbean, especially because the most vulnerable populations are those most affected and that suffer the most the consequences of climate change that will lead them to search for new places to settle down. From UNEP, I want to highlight that we work with all countries in Latin America and the Caribbean in climate resilient initiatives, especially in terms of NDCs, national strategies, and understanding how to fast track climate mitigation through innovative policies and decision making, as well as investing. We consider that potentially migrant and host populations rely on the goods and services in the system that are affected by extreme climate events. And that's why we want to focus in solutions based in nature to increase the resilience of populations, both in origin countries and host countries. In this webinar, the objectives we have, I don't want to dig deeper because we're going to have a very important discussion further on. Our attendees are really marvelous. What we want to achieve today is to raise awareness on the challenge that displacement and migration related to climate risks and betterment the understanding of the complexities of this link. We also want to facilitate knowledge sharing initiatives that address human mobility from different dimensions, including the recovery of services and livelihoods, and also to champion for the integration of the migration and displacement dimension in the discussion in the road to COP28, especially in the global adaptation goal and the adaptation for financing losses and damages. Last but not least, I want to thank everyone to be here today and hope we have a very fruitful evening. I hope that this discussion inspires collaboration in climate change. Thank you very much. Thank you. And since we're starting, I want to present to you James Hayslip, who is from the UNEP Center in Copenhagen, so that we can start talking about this important topic of human mobility and climate change. So James, the floor is yours. Yes, can you hear me? Yes, we hear you perfectly. Good morning from Copenhagen. I work here at the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center. And what I'm going to present today is the key messages of a report we published last month together with the IOM on mobility and human displacement, and especially the opportunities for integrating policies in national plans regarding climate change. If you allow me first to introduce our center in Copenhagen, we are an institution that provides consultancy in terms of energy, climate, and sustainable development with more than 30 years of existence. Today, we're more than 60 people from different nationalities, more than 30, working from all corners of the world. We have a steering committee, which is joined by UNEP and the Foreign Ministry of our country. And we have more than 100 ongoing initiatives, especially the project called Ultima Misha, which is a global strategy from UNEP. To start, I think it's very important to start talking about climate and key terminology. Since the audience is people from all sectors, we should distinguish between who is a migrant and who is a displaced person, because it's not the same. And perhaps there's very nuanced differences that not all understand. A migrant doesn't have an official uh, definition under international law, but is a person who moves from their place of residence by crossing an international border for a variety of reasons that can be voluntary or involuntary, but not forced. So a displaced person is someone who has been forced to move and leave their homes, usually because of conflict, violence, and if they cross an international border, they become refugees. And if they're within their own countries as citizens, but they have moved, then they are internally displaced populations. And the work we do here in Copenhagen is focused around internally displaced individuals, IDPs. And during the last 10 years, it has grown. And it has grown to more than 110 million people total. They usually live in poor countries in a protracted situation. And our colleagues for the UNHCR can maybe clarify on this, but the official definition of an IDP is of about 25,000 people who have moved to a stable place. Definition, 75% of displaced individuals qualify as populations in a protracted situation. It's not an emergency or short-term displacement, but a long-term displacement. And therefore, the need for solutions at a structural and long-term level is more important than ever. This, of course, creates problems and challenges of the poor countries that host these populations. And there's two pacts at an international level on refugees, which are targeted to alleviate the pressures on host countries and also to enhance the self-sufficiency of these populations. Instead of receiving direct help in emergency settings, moving into more sustainable solutions. Now, in terms of climate change as factors in displacement, as Juan mentioned, the IPCC becomes ever clearer regarding climate change as a driver of migration, involuntary and displacement as well, in case of extreme climate events. They can also be indirect drivers by the weakening of zones that are hardly impacted by climate change. That's a more slow process. A few data that I want to mention. I think Juan talked about the numbers of last year, 2022. We had 78 events related to climate that had an impact. 86% were episodes related to storms or floods that caused most casualties of more than 1,000 people. And in terms of economic impact, these events costed more than $1,000 million. But the real impact is even larger, probably. We don't have enough data to calculate it more specifically. And as well as Juan mentioned, in the nexus of human mobility and climate change, we have specific regions that are most impacted and are more sensitive to climate risk that can cause displacement, for example, in the Andes, northeastern Brazil, and the north of Central America. And this information comes from the IPCC. As well, in Caribbean islands, we expect migration to rise as a result, direct result of climate change. And we also have a very important report by the World Bank called, well, I don't remember the name actually, but according to them, climate change could contribute to the movement of more than 2,200 million people within their own countries, that is not refugees, and that the term climate refugee no longer exists, but that studies centers around internal displacement on a slow growing scenario. I think that is a very conservative number, 200 million peoples thus far, until 2050. And also, according to the IPCC, in terms of displaced individuals living in settlements, either internally displaced or refugees, most people live in highly exposed areas in terms of warming and climate risks. And that also reveals the weakness, right? So at the same time, the IPCC points out that these populations that usually live in settlements um, are usually prolonged, even 2 or 3 generations more than intended. And in these temporary situations that become permanent. And that creates economical and legal barriers in their capacity to adapt or migrate away from climate impacts. That is, that populations are trapped by other reasons in areas that are very exposed to climate change. So finally, focusing on policies, that was the focus of the IOM study we carried out. And I think that the great challenge here is how to break the patterns that exist between two very large silos of institutional infrastructure at a global level, from ministries in countries, governmental agendas, and even donors. On the one side, ministries and agencies that regard mobility and displacement, as well as climate change and sustainable development, don't exist linked to each other. They have more informal bonds. And so what we say in the study is that we need to integrate these populations in NDCs, NAPs, and integrate them into international and national policies, because they are populations living in protracted situations. And we need more strategic solutions in the long term. This is to overcome this sort of temporary permanence status that result in lower progress conditions in terms of sustainable development. Our work in Copenhagen is more linked to clean energy. And we know that populations that live in displaced conditions don't have enough access to clean energy when compared to communities surrounding these areas. And in regards to energy, I'm going to mention this example briefly: how to break the silos and collaborate within agencies to look for solutions for these populations that fall between the gaps, right? That are lost between the gaps. So this is what we created: a global platform for action on energy in situations of displacement. It's kind of a long name, but it is what it is. And we have members of all the agencies listed below, and some of them are here today in this webinar as well. And it is aimed at organizing financial resources related to clean energy in regarding to situations of displacement, because we didn't have any plans before. So that was the GPA objective. And here we have a chart that we included last year in our reports. Listed here are all the members of the GPA and who is credited with climate funds to invest in clean energy, assuming that those are the sources of investment. So the idea that we would be allowed to give funds to national plans. So most organisms from the humanitarian side don't have an accreditation with the GCF. So they are in need of collaboration with other agencies. For example, UNIF, WFP, other agencies of this list. And many people ask me, why is UNEP you're working if you don't have any mandate? But it is true. It is just one aspect in the search of solutions in terms of energy and displacement. It is part of the UNEP strategy that we will work with the UNHCR and the UN Interagency Global Plan of Action to support access to clean energy for refugees. And from the humanitarian side, we are partners of the Clean Energy Challenge, which is a global campaign launched by the UNHCR in the first Forum of Refugees in 2019. And you can see the link there. And finally, my last slide is a list of publications alongside different partners of UNEP, only to prove that we have knowledge and capacity in this matter, and that we are open to work and dialogue, both internally as well as intersectionally with other agencies, to hopefully offer technical support to our partners in the humanitarian side. So this is it. Is this okay, Daniel? Danny, you're muted. Hi, can you hear me now? Yes, we can hear you now. Great, James. So thank you to you from the Copenhagen Center of UNEP. And we have a central element here that is perhaps our focus today with populations. So that's why we want to talk to a representative of an affected population by climate change, which is why we have Guadalupe here, who is from the El Bosque community in Mexico. So, Guadalupe, the floor is yours, and tell us, please, your experience in the topic. Oh, I'm losing the signal. Sorry. Can you hear me? Yes, we hear you great. Mm, our experience as a community, it's been very difficult, especially in the last year. We have lost a large part of our community, including our schools. Everything that represented our community was taken by the sea. But it's not something like having a rise in sea level and seeing what is left behind and rebuilding, because when the sea advances, it stays there and it doesn't go back. So we have lost everything as a community. Not only our land, our houses, our families have disintegrated because a lot of people who lived there had to move forcibly because they don't have a place to stay. They don't have a home. They don't have anything. And they had to be displaced to close locations. But there they also lose their jobs because El Bosque was dedicated 100% to fishery. So we were impacted environmentally, but also economically, socially, in every aspect. So from my experience, I can tell you that the climate change is very hard to experience. We're living it and we're experiencing very hard situations. We have learned, of course, but very hard lessons. So you stay in your community when the weather is bad and you think, what's going to happen? Because slowly the sea is advancing about 10 meters that are uh, advanced, they stay there. So in 2019, we lost the coast or pine line that identified us as a forest community. We lost all of that and we started losing our identity. Our families, they had to forcibly migrate. Some of us stayed behind. I stayed in the community because I had to be there to see what we can do, what we can salvage. But sometimes when the sea gets there, you have to flee for your life. You can't rescue material things. But as a community, we have learned in a very catastrophic manner. It's very sad that I have to tell children that next year we will be better, but it's very hard because it hurts a lot. I don't have any words to explain what we have lived through. So, for example, on December 24th last year, we have to face one of the hardest ones since I've lived there. I've been living there since I was 12 years old, and I never saw a cold front after another that was as strong as last year. And on New Year's Eve, Christmas, we had to leave our homes, something that was celebrated together by the community, and now we couldn't even had Christmas dinner and not even think about a feast, a roof over our head. When I woke up that morning, I thought this is like a horror movie. I thought it was a nightmare and I couldn't wake up. But climate change is like that, it's cruel. And we in Tabasco are very vulnerable geographically. And if all the coastlines started suffering, we would be millions of displaced individuals because we're forced. It's not because we want to live. We don't have any place to stay. So we have hope to be relocated but governmental processes are quite extended. As a community, we don't have any more time. The Norths are forgiving us so far, but October, November, December, these cold fronts called Norths are hitting us very hard. And if it's less like last year, and I fear it will be worse, we won't exist anymore as a community, and we won't have anywhere else to go. So it's very hard. The El Bosque community is very worried. We are taking giant leaps in terms of displacement. And this year, these last 3 months I'm talking about, are very important because it's when the bad weather starts. The cold fronts come, the waves hit us, and not having any protection of the tree line, it's even worse. For example, storms that were of, I don't know, 100 kilometers per hour of winds weren't felt that hard before because we had protection, but now there's nothing stopping the storm from us. It's a very complicated situation. So we had to live through terrible conditions. We don't have energy. It's very coming and going. Our respirators, our refrigerators stopped working. We used to have clean water. We had well, we filtered that water, but now we don't have those uh, water wells because it's now contaminated by seawater. We don't have any bathrooms. We live terribly. I don't even know how to explain it. We are resisting what the sea will leave us. We are maybe one of the first communities that are being ended by climate change, but I know that we won't be the last. There's reports of other communities that are starting to suffer the same thing, and they're asking me, what are you doing to be heard? I used to hear about climate change before, and I thought, well, those who live in cities should be careful because they're polluting. But I didn't remember, about the sea. I thought the sea would be the last to suffer the consequences of climate change, but it was the first. It hurts a lot. Having to give people hope and tell them, yes, you just have to wait, it's going to get better, hang in there. It's very hard. Right now, we don't feel we have a future. We're living day by day. Today we live, we have fishes. On the days that everything is okay, we kind of forget about everything that's going on. But in the long term, we don't have a future, and we're losing our identity as fishermen and women. We don't know what we're going to do. What is going to happen with us is not clear. And this situation in the future is going to be suffered by other communities that are going to be in our shoes. So you think, what's going to happen? How can we ask for help? It's very sad. Climate change is unforgiving. It doesn't forgive rich, poor. When the sea gets like that, it just devastates everything in their way, in its way. And we live from the sea. It gives us our food, our livelihoods. So when it takes everything away, it's hard to explain what we feel. In every way, there's no logical explanation. Some people had to go to therapy because losing everything from one day to another, you build your house and for years cultivate a community. And even if we weren't more developed, the most developed community, we had floor beneath us. We had forgotten about ant lights. And these temporary uh, refugees and settlements, are filled with ants now. Those who were able to rent in the city are a bit better, but those who didn't have the money and have to move to shelters, I don't know, in a sports center nearby, we had to shelter there because we couldn't stay in our community. Thank you, Guadalupe. Sorry, I am having. Oh, okay, I can hear you now. So thank you for your testimony of everything you're suffering in the Tabasco community. The sea has been impacting us very hardly. So we want to figure out what you say, right? Strategies uh, to get solutions. Marta is going to present now an expert panel that will try to figure out a few solutions to these challenges. So Marta, the floor is yours. Thank you, Dani, and especially thank you, Guadalupe, for sharing your experience. That makes us realize that those numbers in our initial presentation, those millions of people who have been displaced, maybe sometimes when you talk about numbers, you don't think about people. It's a bit impersonal. You talk about, okay, millions of people, but behind each one, there's the hard conditions that you share. And that puts us in a position of responsibility and accountability. And in many agencies of the United Nations, from these different perspectives, we're starting to put our efforts and our collaboration into alignment of policies in order to reach territories like Guadalupe's community, to support both in the situation that people don't want to be displaced, firstly, that's where their roots are. And sometimes, if it's necessary, to help them in that transition, in give them better shelters and supporting that population that moves into new areas totally impoverished, without homes, without property, and helping them overcome that vulnerability in terms of security, health, mental health as well is critical. So I would love to welcome our panel here, Pablo Escribano from the IOM, Maria Vances from the UNHCR, and Adriana Moreno from the World Food Plan, with whom we're going to debate this coordination and the need for action. I want to ask a first question. We talked at the beginning about how is it possible or not that these migration movements that are impacted by so many factors. What experiences do we have? What perspectives? And how is it possible to find a link between climate change and human mobility? So, Pablo, do you want to start? Marta, thank you for giving me the floor to start. To link effectively the relationship between human mobility and climate change. James talked about a few numbers that really show some evidence and are related to displacement in terms of disasters, because climate change and climate emergencies affect in various ways, if directly and indirectly, in mobility, But perhaps in case of climate disasters, we have the most clear information. You have, for example, 2.1 million displacements for caused by climate change. It's usually the number one cause for displacement in a region, floods and storms, as well as earthquakes, which is not a climate-induced disaster. But usually we have more displacement caused by climate factors than violence or otherwise. So we have a lot of the information in that, in the risk management of disasters. We have a lot of information and identification of numbers in the region. But what is harder to quantify is the impact of climate change in stories like Guadalupe, when we have situations of displacement and people moving to temporary shelters, but caused by slow climate degradation. For example, there could also be situations of droughts that affect the livelihoods of people. So those situations are harder to quantify, but we know we are there. There are some areas in the continent who have increased risk, and we have some projections, for example, from the World Bank, but at the moment, it's very hard to identify the amount of people that have to move from, for example, droughts, especially because we have a lot of uh, factors in terms of food insecurity, economic factors, but we have limited information, as well as areas like plant movement. But we have a lot more information in terms of migration caused by climate factors along the continent, with some countries having more information than others. You're muted, Marta. Sorry, thank you. Yes, the large scale numbers of climate induced mobility are very vague, but perhaps the World Food Plan and the UNHCR have better numbers because they have the reasons of why migrants have moved from a different place, or they have to take logistical decisions in terms of food, health. For example, from the UNHCR, how do you see this perspective? Can you hear me? Yes, thank you. All panelists, Danielle, and of course, Guadalupe, for giving a face to these complex situations that we're experiencing. From the UNHCR, we want to provide some data in the correlation of climate change and human displacement. People from violence have been forced to move from their usual residence and can't go back to their countries, right? More than 21.5 million people are displaced each year by climate events like storms, droughts, forest fires, as well as extreme temperatures. 90% of people displaced come from vulnerable countries that are less prepared to adapt to climate change. 40% of refugees in these countries also make up 70% of internally displaced individuals from violent situations. 9 out of 10 people who are forced to move because of war or human rights go back to their countries because they are settled in climate risk zones. Climate change is systemic cause of vulnerability that can degrade living situations and cause displacement to other countries. We have also seen that the adverse effects to climate change contribute to human mobility, forced displacement, and vulnerability, as well as people becoming trapped between conflicts and climate change, both in host countries and the countries they return to. Climate change is not per se a conflict, but a lot of times generates conflicts as well as competition for resources, for example. Persecution, discrimination can all stem from climate change as well. So we want to point out that these displaced populations are exposed and vulnerable to climate situations and have less support. For example, many times they have to settle down in at-risk locations and have a harder time adapting to new places. Climate change can also have repercussions in long-term solutions for refugees finding a permanent settlement and returning to their origin countries. We are seeing that climate change has increased the displaced individuals. And I wanted to show a last piece of data that climate events can exacerbate as well some resources and sectors in the economy, like, for example, farming, forestry, and water usage. It's very hard to achieve a long-term accommodation for these internally displaced populations and refugees. And this is making them more likely to be affected by conflict. Another situation that is taking place is that people are being displaced for other reasons and are also being affected then by climate change, which uh, undermines their self-sufficiency and resiliency, causing more crisis. The risk of losing their homelands can also increase with climate dangers, especially when people lose their documentation. People in vulnerable situations and those affected by conflict are also being hit hard by climate change. The statistics and data related to climate change are often hard to record. We don't have enough historic data and it's hard to measure. So it's very important to have facts to carry out policies or design response policies and prevention strategies. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Adriana. Do you want to add something else in terms of emergency response? Yes, thank you, colleagues, for giving us the space, and it was very inspiring hearing Guadalupe that talks about the challenges of climate change, from the World Food Plan that fights food security for food security. We see the intersectionality of human mobility and climate change. Especially, we want to mention three things: the impact of climate change in food security, of the 10 million people that are facing food insecurity, approximately 400,000 are migrants. So in many countries where we work, we have seen how climate change affects food security, like sea level rise, droughts, floods that can cause damages in infrastructure, livestock, and the livelihoods of people. And that results in a decrease in the production of food, and that can result in food insecurity. The second is migration. We work in places that are prone to climate events like droughts, in where communities depend on fisheries, agriculture, farming. And when these communities have significant loss, many are forced to internally be displaced to other regions or even other countries in search of other livelihoods and resources. In regards to mobility in Central America, in 2022, we carried out a study that demonstrated that 1 of every 3 homes suffered from food insecurity. And it was one of the causes to look for a place to move. The third thing we wanted to talk about is the vulnerability of poor populations, as they are the most affected by climate change and mobility. These people often lack from the capacity to adapt to extreme climate events and therefore fall even harder in cases of climate change and extreme climate events. So we have to work in adaptation and building resiliency in communities. For example, fostering sustainable farming practices and agricultural practices, creating early trigger alerts. We also provide humanitarian aid to people affected by climate change, including moving personnel, giving support to food and also education. And we want to also strengthen the response capabilities to areas that are prone to extreme climate events. So the international community needs to have a greater financing to respond to the intersectionality of human mobility and climate change. And talking about what the UNHCR colleagues said, we need to have more data to understand how all these situations are evolving and how can they be managed in a better way. Thank you. Thank you, Adriana. And I think you also have been also setting the basis from our discussion. After our initial analysis between the link of climate change and human mobility, whether they be in the short term or the long term, in this framework on how to start these discussions and bring them to COP28, maybe the next question, and we can highlight more specifically each one of you. What are the reasons for these strategies and how the adaptation strategies of each country can support better to minimize the need for human mobility? And also, how can they help the extreme vulnerability suffered by displaced populations? Adriana, since you were talking, perhaps you want to continue? Yes, of course. So the actions that we have identified that contribute to prevent migrant movements are two. First, strengthening food security. For example, promoting agricultural practices that avert the movement of populations to acquire food, and also focusing on vulnerable populations. Our adaptation campaigns are targeted at restoring ecosystems and creating infrastructure that is resilient. So, for example, in 2022, the WFP helped more than 500,000 people in Bolivia, Colombia, El Salvador, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, in creating assets that will help to preserve uh, natural resources, building resilient infrastructure, as well as irrigation or drainage systems that will favor the climate situations. Another strong topic in terms of contributing to avert migrant movements are strengthening the livelihoods of people. We talk about diversifying income so that people are less reliant on agriculture and therefore less vulnerable to climate conditions. So we work with entrepreneurs, capacity building, creating micro businesses, and finally related to disaster preparation and aversion. More than 180,000 people were benefited from insurances related to climate. So adaptations is also linked to early trigger events, disaster prevention, and helping people prepare for disasters and governments to support individuals after them. So these adaptation capacities have the potential to make communities less vulnerable to climate conditions, but this requires continuous investment as well as coordination from humanitarian and social organizations to guarantee that these strategies are focused to whoever needs them. Thank you, Adriana. Maria? Hmm, thank you. I think this is a bit related with what we wanted to talk about. In terms of adaptation strategies, we think it's important to distinguish. I don't want to go into great detail, but to really distinguish the difference between forced movements and refugees so that they benefit better from the situations and international framework. So not everyone displaced is a refugee. Under international law, we should analyze these different circumstances when we have, for example, situations of violence and conflict, are going to have different responses in terms of movement generated by climate change. So we should analyze the differences in qualifications and responses of people displaced for different reasons. In terms of adaptation to climate change, I think the international framework is a way to apply these strategies, especially in terms of research, to analyze the deeper impact that these populations are suffering. For example, the Sendai framework, as well as including these individuals displaced by conflict and including them in prevention, adaptation, and national policies. No one can be left behind, and that is why it's important to have inclusion and articulation of these people into political decisions and national plans. Lastly, the national adaptation plans and the NDCs in which each country has an action plan, it's important to take into account climate factors and understand how it can be linked to the reduction of disasters and preparedness to protect the most vulnerable individuals who have suffered persecution, human rights violations, and integrate them with people who have been suffering the effects of climate change. Pablo, do you want to add something else? Thank you. So briefly, I want to mention two little things. In terms of adaptation, we want to prevent forced migration, that it doesn't become an obligation, right? That people are not obliged to leave their homes. And from the IOM perspective, it's important to integrate mobility into adaptation plans. Because if we adapt, we can avert displacement. That is the link that Adriana mentioned in terms of risk prevention. In terms of communities and how the most vulnerable sometimes don't have the option to migrate, even if they want to, that is a differential impact we have to analyze. In terms of mobility, we also have to take into account that it can be positive, for example, evacuations, remittances, planned migrations. It can be positive as long as we have the adequate framework and we integrate migration into these national plans. And finally, the necessity to integrate internally displaced people into these frameworks that protect vulnerable migrants and individuals. We have certain, for example, examples in Argentina, El Salvador, that have included chapters in their adaptation plans related to climate change. And those are very positive because they advance policies and help us assess for the future the strategies that should be taken. We can take them as best practices in the NAPS development in the future. Thank you. Yes. And I think we have also referred in some way to how adaptation strategies can be useful to decrease vulnerability and also mitigate the need for migration, as well as helping the needs that stay behind of those that stay behind. I think that what we have been talking about has been very interesting in terms of institutional coordination. In the UN, we are covering very similar areas from different mandates. We from UNEP work, for example, with ecosystem restoration, resilient infrastructure, risk management at the short or long term. In terms of risk management, I also think it's paramount when talking about the climate dimension because we have a lot of impact analysis, and that can be very useful information, not only to help migration, but also to prevent it, where we can place origin centers, for example, from sea rise events or floods, droughts, places that are more vulnerable to food security. Perhaps to close this topic and considering that we are getting closer to the COP28 in a few months, less than 2 months actually, and seeing all these integration needs of these topics in the national adaptation plans, as well as energy planning in countries, um, energy availability to populations, key areas. I want to close with a few key messages of what you mentioned. What do you think we can put in the table in these international negotiations that will be fundamental to address such a broad topic? Maria, do you want to start now? Yes, thank you very much. So, a few key messages from the UNHCR. We understand that the road to the COP28 is a coordinated UN event, as well as with governmental agencies and regional frameworks in regards to migration and human mobility. So it's important to realize that every party has something to give an input, and collaboration is key. We want to call for increased financing from states to protect individuals affected by conflict and climate change, and also to help host countries. We want to have additional support into recovery of damages and losses. We also want to involve displaced communities in the way in which they are affected, to guarantee protection of displaced individuals and refugees, and have them be included in the COP28, and also to boost the ambition in terms of policy implementation and how to help the most fragile sectors of these regions. Also, from 13 to 15 December, we are celebrating Refugee Day, and we will be mobilizing people to help protect refugees and climate-driven displacements to increase resiliency to climate change. So this process will allow commitments from states in this intersectionality between human displacement and climate change, by giving available financing to people, adopting policies and inclusive plans and laws that really reflect the needs of the people impacted by this crisis. Finally, that these intersectoral technical capacities are integrated with data recollection, as well as private financing and the inclusion of banks and financing institutions into these plans. Thank you, Adriana. Can you move forward? Yes, like my colleague mentioned, we are working with this forefront of the climate change. The solutions that we in the WFP are taking to the COP28 are solutions to aid communities suffering from food security and mitigate damages and loss caused by climate events. We also want to increase financing to those affected by conflicts. Also in terms of prevention, early detection is going to be a great part of COP28. And finally, solutions of transforming food networks, like for example, school food plans. So what are the protections in place to aid in climate change? What are the measures being taken to aid individuals who are suffering from these impacts? Those are the things we want to address at COP28. Thank you, Adriana. So, Pablo? Yes. Well, I want to start by saying that within COP, or the mechanism of the Warsaw strategy, we include these issues of mobility being integrated into these scenarios. In terms of key messages, I think the first thing is how to continue integrating mobility into the damage and loss discussions, including a new fund for damage and loss, with the increased challenge that some of these losses can be economical and some are not. Something that, for example, Guadalupe mentioned in terms of the mental impact that it has had in communities and in terms of their identity as communities. So I think that we have to bring this to the table in terms of discussion. Also, in terms of adaptation, I think the COP is a great scenario to foster comprehensive integration of mobility in adaptation plans and the global targets, as well as regional practices. In Latin America and the Caribbean, we can bring a lot of information in this matter. Thirdly, in terms of damages and losses, we have to continue protecting financing to the plans that aid human mobility. Perhaps it's very expensive sometimes. For example, relocating the populations in risk zones in a planned manner. And also, I wanted to mention that we need to collaborate in terms of climate action, risk prevention, and human mobility. We have to have a comprehensive and integrated agenda. Regional discussions have to be part of the environment and climate discussion. Thank you. Thank you. So I also have a few key messages to share that I think were parts of all the presentations, ensuring the livelihoods and the viability and possibilities of the populations that want to stay in their origin places by making infrastructure more resilient, having food security plans, securing the resources available to the population. Also, in terms of financing, we are going to be discussing in the COP the damage and loss mechanisms. So I think it's very important to include adaptation in that debate. We're still exploring this subject, even though it's growing. What are the better channels to increase adaptation? And how to move from a planning and adaptation stage that has been the focus during the last few years to move to our more real implementation stage that requires not only the aid of international funds and UN agencies, but also from the participation of the private sector to really channel all these financing and resources in an adequate manner to help in these emergencies. In terms of coordination, I think this is a key message in your interventions. We have a few questions as well from the audience. One of them related to, well, it's kind of a different question from what we have been discussing about the interaction of climate change and mobility? Is it only related to negative aspects? What about the positive? Is there any? Hmm, you have the floor. Maybe I can start? That's a good question, right? Because what we were discussing in terms of adaptation, there are some implications that can be positive. For example, one, and I think it's interesting, is that when we talk about the numbers in terms of displacement, we include um, people forced to move, but also evacuations. So when evacuation is included in prevention, it can avert the loss of life. So mobility can also include positive movements like evacuations. And when we include it in national strategies, it can limit the exposure of communities to adverse events. Also, migrant communities also send remittances to origin communities, which can help to diversify incomes. The IPCC points out that the more agency, resources, and preparedness migrants have, the better the results. So, if we can create human rights frameworks to help them find resources and self sufficiency, human mobility could have a positive impact, right? Diversifying income, livelihoods, relocations, evacuations, all those things can be good, which is why we have to have a comprehensive view of human mobility to also underscore the positive consequences of these processes. Yes, to add to what Pablo said, regarding the dynamism that remittances can cause, we have seen evidence that investment in communities can come from migrant movements to make the economy more dynamic in these communities. So we have seen, for example, in Central America, experiences in which remittances have been used to create small businesses, invest in infrastructure in communities, and in that way, migration can be positive. But like Paulo said, right, in a planned way. Yes, and from my side, like you mentioned, in human mobility, both migrants, refugees, IDPs, people who were forced to move, what is important is what they will provide in the host places. It can be an opportunity. They can, for example, create a great exchange if there's adaptation policies, response policies, and so that these new communities can be included in development plans. So we have to see how communities can lead to the creation of new policies and what they can input in terms of actions like employment creation, helping in the fields. For example, in Brazil, we have seen that they can collaborate to prevent the deterioration of the ecosystem. So they can collaborate with local authorities, not only in employment creation, but also in the energy sector. I think it's very important to um, make them foster conversation, give them a seat in the table in terms of protecting nature. So I think they have a lot to say because uh, people who have migrated also used to help in their origin communities. So why not in their host communities? They can help people be more eco-friendly. and they can contribute to different areas, which is a plus. They can help prevent climate change and also increase resiliency. Thank you. Another question was, when talking about the inclusion in national policies and adaptation plans, interagency coordination, who can be the best allies in the region at this regional or sub-regional level? How can we create coordination between governments, institutions to support the development of these collaboration? What are those regional coordination strategies that we mentioned, right? How can we manage inequality, vulnerability? Yes, I want to mention an example. We are working with the Central American Integration System, and one of the initiatives we carried out is measuring resiliency to formulate intervention plans. So a very valuable experience that we have developed together with the SIC and their food security plan is in the Trifinio zone, the frontier between Honduras, El Salvador. With this resiliency measure, we carried out a development proposal. For example, giving people knowledge from basic services, food security, literacy. So we're talking with the Ministry of Inter-American Integration and other agencies here in reviewing security policies. So in food security policies, there's a lot of elements that go hand in hand with other factors. So we have to strengthen policies and introduce any relevant topics with problematics in the region, the Central American corridor, for example, their interaction with fishermen and the populations affected by food security that is a lot of times linked with climate change. And also the support we give countries' governments in terms to access resources and financing tools. I'll end with that. Thank you, Pablo. Maria, anything you want to add? Pablo, should I go first? Yes, go ahead. Thank you. So Adriana explained it very well. I think it's very important to have national frameworks. Also, the National Conference on Migration that has a focus in this interaction between governments and institutions, human mobility, climate change. How can we respond and prevent? Another of the frameworks can be, for example, next year, it's the 40th anniversary of the Cartagena Declaration of Refugees. And this will be a new regional framework, a new action plan for the next 10 years. And one of the areas of focus is the response to climate change and the interaction that it has with displacement. So I will think it will be a great intersectional debate that will give us an opportunity to find solutions along with those affected and elaborate a 10-year framework moving forward. Climate change will be a key issue on this discussion. And finally, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has had a consultant opinion related to the duties of states in terms of international law to respond to human rights violations related to climate change. I think that is also a regional framework to explore the legal dimension that will give us a framework to respond to emergencies. The SICA also, like we mentioned, is a program that collaborates with other agencies. So Pablo, I leave you the floor for any other comment. I don't have that much to add. I think that the Inter-American Court will be very important when they issue that consultative opinion in relation to the duties of states in the response to forced mobility driven by climate change. Also, North and South, we have a lot of forums for discussion. And for example, the Climate Week that will take place in a month. These will be very important scenarios to address these topics. In the IOM, we are organizing national discussions, and we invite different stakeholders to join the table, as everyone has a role to play to address these problematics. It's not just environment, disasters, mobility. We also have to include the other sectors in the discussion and build platforms to address these topics. Great. So thank you, everyone. And effectively, I think it's a great time to build platforms, like you mentioned, and in the road to the COP, where we will have regional discussions of agreement and common positions. I think migration is still a sector that requires a lot of dialogue so that people join in the duties, as everyone is affected. Migration affects host countries, but also everyone in the region, and it's a reality, an ever-rising responsibility. We have a lot of projections of climate change in the region, especially in Central America and the Caribbean. They are very worrisome. We're going to be very affected by food security and resources in communities. And it's going to continue to happen. So I think it's a very important time facing these international negotiations and these discussions, framework, action, coordination, international financing mechanisms, implying financing agents and other stakeholders to climate change adaptation. We have to include them, right, in the discussion. So thank you very much. It's been very enlightening hearing all your work, your mission, your position. It gives us great signals on how to collaborate between agencies in the UN. So thank you, all three, and as well as Guadalupe, Juan, James, and all attendees that have joined us today and the audience. So thank you. Marta, thank you to you as well. And we would also like to help all of those who joined us in the stream today, seeing the relationship between human mobility and climate change. The next talks in the COP28 road related to the climate action and the crisis we're facing are coming soon. So please, we will see you in the future.